This is Triaging Time, and I'm your host, Dan Luna. Today's show, we have Dave Cooper. Dave Cooper was born and raised in Mannheim, PA. In 1987, he earned a bachelor's with an emphasis on molecular biology and entered the military that same year, specifically to become a U.S. Navy SEAL. During his 25-year career, Dave spent nearly 19 of those at the prestigious Naval Special Warfare Development Group, conducting combat operations throughout Eastern Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Dave's early operational history includes deployments in support of Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. In 1993, he was selected for the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. From 1994 to 2012, he completed dozens of deployments both in and out of major theaters of war, to include such places as Haiti, Bosnia, Somalia, Yemen, Afghanistan, and Iraq. He has led extensively in combat and all levels and has executed missions spanning the full gamut of naval special warfare capabilities. From September 2009 to September 2011, Dave served as the Command Master Chief, the Senior SEAL Operator, and Principal Advisor to the Commanding Officer of Naval Special Warfare Development Group. And he was also my boss. During his tenure, the Naval Special Warfare Development Group successfully executed some of the most significant special operations missions in the history of the U.S. military, in a role that took him from the battlefield one minute to the interagency boardroom the next. Dave's influence, interpersonal skills, and leadership were instrumental to the unparalleled success of this elite unit. From his distinguished service, Dave was awarded numerous unit and personal awards, to include a Silver Star, 6 Bronze Stars with V devices, 2 Distinguished Meritorious Service Medals, 2 Meritorious Service Medals, 4 Presidential Unit Citations, and numerous other joint and individual awards. But as he proudly notes, and I love this, every medal we wear on our chest belongs in no small part to our teammates, because it's from our teammates and from them that we draw our message of courage. Dave is the founder of Verge. Man, I got goosebumps reading that, Dave, so I appreciate you putting that in there. Dave is the founder of Verge, a boutique coaching and consulting company whose mission blends the profound experiences and lessons learned from the Naval Special Operations arena with such diverse disciplines as complexity, science, and psychology to form a unique brand of organizational health consulting and coaching. Dave's earned his master's degree at the University of Oxford and HEC Paris. He is featured in the best-selling book, The Culture Code, along with some of the most innovative business leaders and researchers in the U.S., and has consulted on organizational health initiatives with Fortune 100 and 500 clients, from major oil and gas companies to nimble startups and tech firms. Dave is also married and has 3 boys, ages 15, 12, and 8. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
You know, so I mentioned this in the email, and I'd spent some time thinking about who's the first SEAL that I'm going to have on here. And I am so excited that you said yes to this. And it's truly an honor, and I'm humbled. And I think it's almost the closing of a loop, because when I first checked in as a new guy, we actually had a pretty good conversation about leadership. So now to be here with you, it's truly an honor. So thank you so much.
Well, mine as well. So it's shared.
Awesome, thank you. So we're gonna dive right into things: life, leadership, volatility, and trauma. If we only had a few minutes, what advice would you share with us?
First I'd say context really matters. So the advice I might give to a group of Americans is not necessarily the same advice I'd give to a group of Brits or Russians or Chinese. So I think that's important to note. But in the most general sense, I'd say if you really want to lead, in a volatile environment, and any environment has a potential to be volatile. But if you want to lead in that kind of environment, and you want to do the least harm possible, then I think you really have to challenge and deepen your thinking, and that means you don't only understand things like critical thinking and what constitutes evidence, but you really dive deeply into some words like sense making and reflection and reflexivity. And it's a tall order to do stuff like that. These aren't easy, and I think particularly for Americans, we live in the most technologically advanced country in the world, yet we are some of the most scientifically illiterate. And so some of those words I just mentioned require people to take some really big leaps if they want to do as I said, and that's really deepen their thinking and then apply that to leading in these volatile environments. That's the short answer.
So what would step one look like? So if we could simplify, and I know we can, in this conversation, we can definitely go down the spiral and make this very complex. If we were to at least start this conversation at a simplified level, at a high level, how would somebody start on that path?
I think one of the places, there any number of places you can start. And if you look, a lot of the academics line things out by steps. The world doesn't necessarily work in sequence. It could, but I would say one of the places to start is simply recognize that each of us, whether you study these things or not, sees the world through the lens of our own preconceptions. And a lot of those, or many of those preconceptions, are given to us by our education, by our experiences, by the people we run with, by our families, by our cultural heritage, all those different things. But when we look at the world, we're not seeing the world as it is. We're seeing the world shaped by our experiences, and many of those include, as I said, biases and preconceptions, and you have to understand that.
So now, understanding that, what does next look like after that?
We would start, if you're talking about reflection, you start with a problem. Something's out of whack. There's an issue out there. Things aren't normal, and now you've got to try and define what it actually is. That's where things like sense making and meaning making come into play. How do we deepen an understanding of the experience we're having? Just recognizing anomalies sometimes is, some people just let it all wash over them. That's the way life is. It's all of a sudden changed like that, and we're just going to cruise through it. Others go, hey, what has just happened here, and how can I make sense of that, and where can we go from there? I'll give you the easy example is early every September, if you drive around, I live in Virginia Beach, right? I kind of get used to the traffic pattern over the summer, and then early in September, there's a sudden change, and there are, traffic jams and stuff like that at 8 o'clock in the morning that weren't there in August. Some people just sit there and go, hey, that's just life. Others are going to go, hey, why is that? It wasn't that way last week. Why is it today? Well, if you dig down into it, school starts in early September and school buses are out there. And now we might work through that situation and say, well, there's these traffic jams out there. Maybe there's another way I can take to work. Maybe I can leave earlier. Maybe I can leave later. That's a very simple aspect of reflecting on a problem right there.
Would you say that there's anything specific to leading in and around volatility?
Well, it's incredibly stressful. Yeah. So, some people use the acronym VUCA, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I come from a school that uses tuna. Right? It's tastier, I guess. But that's turbulent, uncertain, novel, and ambiguous. And if we use the word complexity, we, by necessity, we mean volatile and uncertain. But you're saying the same thing. But those environments create a lot of stress. And so if you're going to lead in an environment like that, apart from all the sense making and stuff like that, you might also want to understand, how to manage that stress as well, and not just for yourself, but for others. Which would be key for me. How do we cope with that?
So knowing you, and just reading your amazing career that you've had, you've dealt with some stress. How have you personally dealt with some of the complexity that you've faced, specifically during your career?
Wow. I mean, we go through everything. I think the one thing I never did was deny it, and that's obviously part of that cycle. I can certainly get angered by it. And some of the most stressful things are some of the things that I watched occur. Very early on in Afghanistan, when bin Laden was reported to still be in Afghanistan, the operators, we didn't know he wasn't. We suspected that he was not any longer in Afghanistan. But anyway, there was a number of missions to get UBL. And one of those was, we came across, the Predator drones came across a convoy headed to Pakistan, 3-car convoy. And so we launched the package, right, to go intercept this convoy. And it was close to the border of Pakistan, and the powers that be back in Bagram said, well, we have to bomb this. And, because the convoy had stopped close to Pakistan, we couldn't go into Pakistan. Of course, one of the occupants of the lead vehicle was tall and wearing white robes, right? So instantly, that's a lens of preconception right there. You're looking at a guy who, from a 30,000-foot height, looks taller than everybody else, who's wearing white robes. Therefore, it must be UBL. A lot of other people. And so they wanted to bomb it. And for me, instantly, I was on the radio on the helicopter saying, hey, don't do this. We can handle it. We can sort it out on the ground. We can get there before they get into Pakistan and stuff like that. Well, that call went unheeded. The bombs were dropped. And when we hit the deck, we discovered, 25 predominantly dead women and children. So those are, I dealt with that through anger. And then you get to the point where that continues to happen over and over again, and you start to shrug your shoulders and shake your head and say, hey, there's nothing I can do here. So it's kind of a learned helplessness. Those are not necessarily effective ways of dealing with stress, but we have to understand that they happen. But you put them into the pot of things that you can't control, right? And I think that's important. And if you don't, and you start to, and I've seen this, where people start to blame themselves for all the things that go wrong that they can't control, that takes you down a really, a bad road, or possibly a bad road. What we did and what I did was started recognizing, those things we could control to some extent, where we could exercise autonomy, and you do the best you can in those environments with what you got. Teddy Roosevelt said something similar to that, so we kind of abide by that advice. Do the best you can with what you got. And you share those experiences. That's another thing we talk about, the stress of leadership. And this could be mom and dad leadership, and it is mom and dad style leadership. Share those experiences. And a lot of times what you find, or what I have found, is when you do share those experiences, it helps you to make sense of those experiences. And then you find also people out there that had similar experiences and had different ways of handling it that you might be able to then adopt as well. And in some cases, you take those pot 2 problems, things that you can't handle, and you move them into the pot 1, places where you can exercise autonomy and choice. That's a big one. And whenever we can exercise choice, that tends to decrease our sense of threat or stress and anxiety. So yeah, a number of ways like that.
Dave, knowing what you know now, if you could give your brand new guy to the teams advice, so you've traveled back in time, you're now a brand new guy, what advice would you give that young Dave Cooper?
I started giving this advice at the end of my career, and it would be the same advice I would give now, and that is, don't believe your own highlight reel. This at the development group or places like Delta Force. We have a highlight reel. We show this to new ambassadors and new flag officers and stuff like that. It's just like my bio that you read, makes you look and sound really cool. But if you do this today, if you go ask my wife to introduce me, she'll introduce me as her oldest child. So there's the reality behind all of that glamour, right? And that's the piece of advice I'd give you. Don't believe your own highlight reel. It's only a tiny, tiny portion of who we are, Latch on to some of those imperfections.
So what drew you to give that piece of advice over those years, to where that's the thing that you share?
No single thing. The world's multiply caused, but and particularly, I'll give you an anecdote. My sister is a mathematician. She is 12 years younger than I am. She called me up. She went to Boston University, and we're talking right before she graduated, and she met a Navy SEAL, young Navy SEAL, and she was going to go out with this guy. And I said, absolutely not. And she's like, well, why? You're a Navy SEAL and you're a nice guy. I said, Sue, I'm your brother. I'm not as nice as you think I am. And I certainly don't want you dating a young Navy SEAL. Sometimes they have all the gifts of energy and strength. And then, they're young. And so it's seeing that, sense of entitlement. It's a little bit of it, a sense of, living a little too much in the now, living a little, accepting too much risk and stuff like that, risky behaviors. All of these different things add up over time to make me say, hey, particularly for the young guys, if we can get you on the road to humility more quickly, that's the right road to be on. And I look at I won't mention any names, but my, role models in the SEAL teams, those guys were incredibly capable, but incredibly humble, and they were, traditionally much older than that 25-year-old guy that my sister was about to go out with. So those are the things that would lead me to say that. And they're all things you would see in young athletes, and young men in general. We want to spirit them out of that world of look at me, I'm great, into the world of, I'm one of many, and adopting that stance of humility. That's what I think.
I love it. I love that. I appreciate you sharing that story too.
Don't tell my sister.
I won't. Hopefully she doesn't watch this. So you mentioned humility. I'm curious now, what other character attributes would you share kind of on a general level, really for warriors? So on a general level, what qualities would you say, hey, whether you're a police officer, whether you're in the Marine Corps, hey, just generally speaking, these are the attributes that I've seen that you admire and that you've seen work very effectively on the battlefield?
Well, it's a great question. And two that jump out immediately, honor, right? Honor and courage. They're two of the Navy core values, right? But, when I say honor, or when we say honor, and I ask people in the Navy this all the time, what are your core values? Honor, courage, and commitment. And my next question is, what does honor mean? And I get these, the deer in the headlights look. And honor is a verb. It means to act in a way that brings distinction on you, your team, your command, your community, your family, your country, right? And I have seen too many times where where people act in a way that is not honorable. So understand what the word means. Honor, it is to bring that distinction. That doesn't mean we won't make mistakes. But what is also an honorable behavior and a courageous one is to be able to stand up and say, hey, mea culpa, I messed that up, or I effed that up, whatever the case might be. And I think that's huge. Courage is another one, but we tend to think of as physical bravery, but courage goes way beyond that. And, if you look at, my favorite example is the Bin Laden raid. It's, that mission didn't necessarily hinge on my 23 teammates that went across the border, although those guys took on really a level of risk that we couldn't even conceive of. There were so many unknowns inside of Pakistan, and they took that risk on. But about 10 days before that, when the president is trying to make the decision as to whether to go or not, he goes around to his cabinet members and says, hey, what do you think? Should we do it? Is it him or not? It starts off right away with the head of the CIA saying, well, it's a 50-50 chance it's him. It was his information that we were operating off of, and here he is saying 50-50 chance. So what they were all saying as they went around to the cabinet members there was, they were all saying essentially the same thing. Don't do it. It's either too risky for the guys going in or it's too politically risky. And I was among a handful of people that were aware of this, and I didn't say anything either. And I watched that trajectory go like this. The mission was not going to happen. Best information we ever had, or intelligence. When really, from the back of the room came a diminutive woman, young girl, one of the analysts and one of the leaders of the teams that of the analysts that found him. They said, hey, stood up and said, hey, it's him. It's him, and here's how I know it's him. And you think of the courage that took right there to overcome all that resistance. I'm blown away by that, and that's moral courage. And I think that's an aspect that we don't exercise enough. And when you see something amiss, you've got to stand up and say, hey, hold on a second. And more importantly than that, if you want to be a leader, leaders occur in all different shapes and sizes. You don't need a title to have one, but you certainly want to be instrumental in creating a space where that kind of behavior is the norm and not the exception. Mm-hmm. And we don't necessarily have that in the military. There are organizations that don't have that either. But you want to create that space where people can just routinely say, hey, I have a concern here. Mm-hmm. So that level of courage just amazed me, and that moral courage is important. Compassion is another one. And compassion doesn't mean we have to wrap our arms around everybody and hug everybody. I'm certainly not that kind of guy. I take it from the Stoics. Jim Mattis uses it this way as well. And compassion means to suffer with. And I think that's an important aspect. And to know what it is. If you're going to ask people to go through the door, as we did in our job, right? I think it's important that you understand what that means and that you have done so as well. We don't have a military today that rewards that kind of behavior. So I just think it's important. People ask me, hey, when were you the most nervous or the most scared in your career? And I can tell you when, and it was watching other people do the job. Going through that door when I knew what lay on the other side of those doors and what could happen. So compassion is another big one. And to understand it means to suffer with. Those are three right there. If you can work on honor, courage, and compassion, along with the humility piece, mm-hmm. you're going a long way down the road to establishing some really virtuous behavior, which incidentally ties right back into some deep and accurate thinking. You need those kinds of virtues and values to get there, in my opinion.
I love it. I have so many questions and so many rabbit holes I want to dive into right now. So the one I'd like to almost go back to is the young woman that stood up. So two things, and just as I hear you tell that story, the first one is how counterculture that is for that to happen, especially in organizations that is so controlling, and I use control as far as the hierarchical system.
Yeah.
So in an organization that's very control, vice create on the other side of that spectrum, creative. And so how counterculture it is, and what I also appreciate is how it was accepted. So in a sense, it was awarded that she was listened to. Do you mind just diving into your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, it is, and I asked her about it, and I've become good friends with her. And she, her answer to that is she cared more for the 3,000 people that died in Manhattan than she did for her career, And that's courage, right? It's not being unafraid of something. It's recognizing that something else is more important, and those people are more important to her. And ultimately the Bin Laden raid more important to her. So that was the impetus for her that allowed her to go against that. Even her boss, who was looking at her while she said that, the first guy that the president said, and he's like, yeah, 50-50, talk about courage. 60-40 would be a little more courageous, right? But yeah, I mean, there's no clear-cut answer to that other than, she, as I said, she found her relationship to the people who died in 9/11 outweighed any relationship she might have had to her career. And that weight allowed her to go forward with it,
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I love that it was awarded too.
Yeah.
Because it could have been punished. It could have just been, hey, we're not going to listen to you. You're junior, so age is a factor. So to have somebody in a room that's younger, were so many other older people in the room. So whether she physically had a seat at the table or was not seated at the table, so even placement. So however the room was situated. And I love the fact that and I think that's what makes it a great story is here's this voice from this junior person, the David and Goliath, if you will, and then she won.
Daisy and Goliath, I guess, in this case. But
What's that?
Daisy.
Daisy and Goliath. Yeah, Daisy and Goliath. I love it. What was the? I'm curious now. What was the energy after she said that? Obviously, it shifted the conversation.
It did shift all eyes on her. And it's hard to say if that was the really the impetus that drove the president to make the decision. His thinking was, I don't care if it's politically risky, it's the right thing to do, which is good, and I appreciate that. So yeah, I don't necessarily know, but I think you're onto something when you say that behavior was rewarded. It was certainly rewarded by people like me who basically slapped her on the back and said, wow, way to go. And we don't necessarily, it goes back to compassion again when I say to suffer with, and we don't reward that behavior in our senior military officials. They don't suffer with. They don't even go forward half the time, right? They don't know what it's like for that young Marine in Fallujah who's getting shot and blown up every day. That kind of behavior is not rewarded in the United States military. What is rewarded is the acquisition of rank. And you can disagree with me all you want, but simply having watched it for 25 years, that's a behavior that's rewarded. And it was important that her behavior was rewarded at least by some in this situation, and we should do more of that. Frank or Jim Mattis used to say that you get the behaviors you reward, right? Many people have said similar things, and to some extent, you certainly do. We have to be careful, right? You can reward behaviors, the wrong behaviors, in some really interesting ways. Monetary incentives and stuff like that. And that's what led to the financial collapse in 2008, with different rewarding of really risky behaviors. So that you can't just say, hey, this is the way to go. We reward these great behaviors to the fullest extent that we can. But we do have to recognize that if we say courage is important and you step up and go against the grain or against the chain of command, instead of slapping that person down, we should be saying, hey, I know it took a lot of courage to do that. Now, I might disagree with you, and we have a real-world example of that right now, and that's Captain Brett Crozier from the Teddy Roosevelt, right? Mm-hmm. He is a guy that went against the grain there, and what happened? Obviously, he was fired, and that's a message to those other commanding officers out there. You will play by the rules, or we're going to fire you. And I think that's unfortunate. And you don't just see that in the United States military, so I don't want to just bust on the military. But hierarchies in general tend to, not reward some of those virtuous behaviors.
Dave,
again, unfortunate.
So it seems that we're shifting a little bit and now talking about culture of an organization. And you wrote a great piece on LinkedIn that you shared with us on LinkedIn talking about the complexity of culture. And I loved it. It was long, and I read the whole thing. So I was proud of myself for reading the whole thing. And I really enjoyed it. I think I had to look up probably 20 different words in there because I'm like, I've never even heard of this word. So,
I know,
so all the education's paying off. I was hoping you could dive into, as you now work with other organizations, what are some of, once again, just at a high level, some of those general things that you've seen implemented in organizations to help with their culture and to help move the organization in a positive direction?
Well, a couple things there. One is our understanding of what culture is. And if you ask a psychologist or you ask a biologist or you ask an anthropologist or you ask an organizational scholar, you're going to get different answers. And that's fine. Context matters. They come at it from their point of view, if you will. And I look at culture as kind of like a ball of yarn. And these days I don't separate culture from leadership, from strategy, from performance, from value creation. Those things are all aspects of the same thing, that big ball of yarn or tapestry or whatever you might want to call it. And we can tug on some of those strings, and maybe one of those strings you call culture, if you will. And what is it? And I think a working definition for it is, those are the beliefs, values, and assumptions that we have, that we make in the world, or that we have, and that those they tend to impact how we think and behave in the world. And they result in what we call patterns of behavior. And they are wildly ingrained. And I think where some do well is to recognize that, the thing they call organizational culture is not one thing. It's a mosaic. We know how cultures emerge, right? And I put a group of people together doing a similar task, marketing, sales, whatever the case might be. Over time, a culture, those beliefs, values, and assumptions will merge and emerge. Well, what emerges out of that is that a pattern of behavior. And people who recognize that allow that to play out. And what they do is very well is they're able to align those diverse cultures. They don't want to squash those diverse cultures. They know there's power in that and potential inside of that diverse mix of people. And at times they know that they need to align it. At other times they can let it drift off a little bit. But when things get volatile, now it's time to start to align these cultures towards what matters now. And that what matters now is something you can take from a mindfulness practice. You can take from any number of different practices, but it's an awareness of what do we need to focus on now, and how can I align these diverse cultures towards getting to that what matters now. And some people do that very well, but I can tell you, man, it's not it's not something that the CEO does. Good companies have teams of people that are almost focused entirely on culture, on keeping an eye on it, on monitoring it, on addressing concerns that arise in the different cultures, And again, who was it, Cotter or somebody said, maybe Peter Drucker, one of those guys, said that, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Sort of, but both are important. And you have to keep an eye on both. But that's a recognition right there that culture is incredibly important. It can be incredibly powerful, and power can work in both ways, right? It can do well for you, or it can take you down the tubes, right? Particularly when you get a toxic culture. So, and that's another thing is when that toxicity arises, here we get back to, being able to reflect again. And there's a problem there. What's going on? Let's reflect on it. And ultimately, let's find a solution to it. And that solution is correcting the problems that lead to the toxicity or removing those toxic people. And then, obviously there's room to play in between that, but that matters tremendously as well. So, culture is a long-term game. And I think if I can sum it up quickly there, it's people that recognize that and put a lot of time and effort into it are going to benefit from it. What do we do at the development group? Every 2 years they do a command climate survey, right? And what happens to that? Who knows? The last one that I was aware of, one young officer described to me as 600 pages of hate mail. And what happened to that? Well, nothing. It just gets tossed. Nothing really happens. And Special Operations came out, 4 months ago or whatever, and did their culture-wide survey on spec ops, if you will. What's going to happen to that? Probably nothing. Those things get shelved. It's called the fallacy of formalization, right? We got all this nice fancy paper. It's in a book this big, and we stick it on the shelf, and that's where it will remain until it disintegrates. Good business leaders and good businesses don't do that.
Wow. So there's a lot of complexity. So this ball of yarn can be very complex. I'm curious, is there certain models that you use, or are there certain tools or things that you like or that you see as helpful to help you navigate that complexity?
Certain tools. Well, the best tool is honest dialogue. The single best tool is honest dialogue. Other people will say, well, that's active participation. Call it whatever you want. I think that's the single best tool out there. And, most of what I deal with in the organizational health world is some level of change. How do we change something? How do we create a better fit between our business or between our team and the environment that we're working in, right? That's got evolutionary change. But the best tool out there is this notion of honest dialogue. And can you create a place where, again, it's the norm, and people don't have to muster some kind of superwoman or superman type courage to say what needs to be said. And again, good leaders are able to, and those leaders occur, again, at all levels, not just people with titles, but influential people inside of that ball of yarn, if you will, helping to create that environment where you can challenge people, and you're expected, to be challenged. And I think in a good assault team, particularly at the development group, and I've seen this at Delta as well, that's the norm. It's, even the best teams run the risk of groupthink. You want somebody to play the devil's advocate. You want somebody to challenge the way you see the world. And there's insights that can be gleaned from the coming together of different worldviews. That's diversity at work again. So, yeah, that is perhaps the best tool out there. Second to that, people who are really good communicators, who can, I don't mean who just use big fancy words. I mean people that can build relationships, and they don't typically use big fancy words. These are people that are trustworthy, they're respectful, their care and concern is genuine, and they build relationships that are based on the exact same thing: mutual trust, mutual respect, and mutual care and concern. Those people are worth their weight in toilet paper these days. So.
Awesome.
Gold toilet paper, I guess.
Hey Dave, I'm looking at my clock and it's moving so fast, and I feel like we've just started. If you're okay with it, I'd like to shift a little bit and maybe touch on another very big topic, trauma.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I work with law enforcement about is, and also other groups, is whether it's in the observer role of watching life be taken, or the passing of life, whether it's right now with as doctors always have, but specifically now maybe it's to a level that they haven't experienced before. Now on the battlefield, seeing things, either taking life or experiencing the loss of life. What are, I guess, almost giving that young man advice again, what would be some advice that you would share, with yourself about being in and around that life and death and those what might be described as traumatic events?
I'm going to go back to the same answer I gave it. You mentioned doctors, and there's a practice that evolved among doctors, and maybe you'll understand this, but doctors and not just docs, but primary care providers in general, and people in the emergency room as well. Those who are seeing patients up close during an illness or during a traumatic injury, whatever the case might be, right? Those individuals tend to commit suicide at rates that exceed other groups in the population, right? And what came out of that, this is years ago at this point, are these things called Bail-in groups. But this gets back to, it's a support group. It's a community of practice. It's people who understand, because they've suffered with, they have that level of compassion. It's not just empathy, which is important, but this is real compassion because they've been there, who have, experienced the same things, coming together to talk about these things, and particularly to share vulnerabilities. And once you can do that, you stand a good chance of growing from the trauma, as opposed to getting crushed by the trauma. And I think that's important. That's that honest dialogue again. That's that place for it. It's that active care and concern. It's respect for the other person's experiences, but it's a sharing there. And that vulnerability piece means it's okay to say, hey, I think I messed this up. Whatever that might be, whether it's an operator on the battlefield. And I've had guys say, I shot the wrong person. Man, that's difficult to admit, and then what do we do from there? And, and then we look at intentions and stuff like that. What was your intention? What was the information you had at the time when you made a decision? Not just the outcome. So we go in that, we focus on that. And then when you start to do that, and we start to share mistakes that I made, other guys start to share their vulnerabilities, if you will. That goes a long way towards helping people as I said, overcome some of these things. Overcome might not be the right word, but to take that trauma and use it for post-traumatic growth, if you will, as opposed to post-traumatic stress. And I'm really talking about the kind of stress that reduces people. And then ultimately, you can't talk about these things without bringing in real experts into the equation. And we do this when I work with the healthcare teams on resiliency. The subject of trauma always comes up, right? But there's always someone on the team who doesn't just understand it from the level of having been there as well, but they understand it from the level of an experienced psychologist or an experienced psychiatrist as well. So I think that's another person that has to be on that team, not just an individual, but a team that helps people overcome some of these things, and learn from them. Mm-hmm. And embrace our own imperfections and our own failures.
It sounds like we've almost gone full circle back to just honest dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sell it too much, but it's a big start. And I had a client of mine was a great group of people. It was a big ski resort, and I spent about a year with them. But at the end, the CEO said, when I showed up, they were at each other's throats. When we left about a year later, the CEO said, "I'm not really sure how you did this." And I said, all we really did was start bringing people together to have conversations, to talk about things in a safe place. And what you start to build when you do that is understanding. And now instead of, the brain is made to jump to conclusions. And if all I ever see are your actions, well, that's what I'm going to interpret, right? If I never talk to you and get a sense of, hey, what did you intend by doing that? Then I'm going to jump to probably the wrong conclusions most of the time. Bring people together, start to talk about these things in a safe place, but do it respectfully. Manage the conflict, use it for you, or use it productively. Now you're going to start to build understanding, and people learn from that. And we learn that, hey, we might work in two different shops, but we have much more in common than we do differences, if you will. Yeah.
Dave, as our time comes to a close, how would you summarize everything that we've covered?
We've been all over the place. I think that's a great summary. Life's messy, man, and it's okay to rummage and go all over the place. That's really what sense making is about. Go all over the place, try these things out, test them out. Environment matters, context matters, and what works for you in one of those. What you pull from the messiness might work in one context, but it's not going to work in another. And kind of embrace that, from the world of complexity, we embrace the kind of messiness, and we try and learn from it. But there are certain tools that we come back to. Virtuous behavior, honest dialogue is a tool. Things like sense making and reflection. Reflexivity is a deeper practice about understanding your own biases and how they impact the world. But all of these things revolve around our relationships that we have with other people. And again, it comes back, if you really want to go full circle, those good leaders are people that can build really solid relationships. And they're moms, dads, brothers, sisters, uncles, cousins, as much as they're CEOs or COOs or nursing leaders or, sergeants or whatever the case might be. Don't need a title to do those things.
That's awesome. Dave, do you have any final thoughts before we go?
I have no more thoughts left in my head. That's it.
No more. That was everything.
That was it. That's all
I doubt it. I think we barely scratched the surface. So anyways, thank you.
Yeah, right on.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. If you know someone who can get something out of this conversation, please share the video. And of course, like and subscribe. And remember, you don't manage time, you manage yourself. Leadership starts with you. Thank you.